D&D's hag is a monster. She is cruelty without purpose, a creature that delights in suffering, that twists bargains, that feeds on misery for its own sake. She steals children, corrupts innocence, and depicted as withered crone to reflect her wicked heart. She makes bargains to trap you, to twist you, to exploit weakness. Unlike devils who want your soul, the hag simply wants you to suffer. And around that suffering, a moral story is built. She is called selfish and spiteful. She is called wicked. Every action is interpreted through the same lens, that she is evil because that is what she is. But for a monster that is inspired by the esoteric Baba Yaga and other hags, their depiction is remarkably flat and one note. Evil for the sake of evil, spiteful for the sake of spite. But Baba Yaga isn't like that. She doesn't exist to be evil, she doesn't exist to be good. She exists in a world that does not organize itself around those categories at all. So how did we get from that to this? How did a figure that once had a function become a monster defined only by intent? I'm going to tell you who Baba Yaga actually is, how she became the witch, and what had to be burned out of her to make her this simple. To understand what we lost, we have to go back, beyond the Disney villains and the caricature, to the primordial woods of Slavic folklore. Her name is Baba Yaga, and she is not what you think she is. She lives in a hut on chicken legs, deep in the forest where the known world ends, where her fence is strung with skulls and her mortar and pestle leave no tracks behind her. She knows the answers to questions that will get you killed if you ask them wrong. And yes, she eats people, or at least she threatens to. But here's what the stories actually show. Across centuries of folklore, tale after tale, nobody is ever actually eaten. The point of the threat is to test you, to measure you. She places you in a situation where the way you act becomes the point of the encounter. The danger is real, but it is not arbitrary, and it is not motivated by cruelty. Nobody knows where she came from. There is no origin story, no moment of creation, no God who made her. She simply exists, at the edge of the forest, at the edge of the world, at the edge of what the map is willing to name. That is her nature, and she predates the moral framework being used to judge her. In some stories, she is a villain, especially to children or to men who wander in without understanding where they are. In others, she is a helper, even a protector, particularly to those who approach her correctly. She can guide, she can give, she can save, and she can also destroy. The difference is your behavior. She is neither good nor evil, but consequence. Heroes come to her when there is nowhere else to go, when civilization has run out of road and the answers they need lie somewhere beyond it. And when they find her, she tests them for something more specific than virtue. Wit, courage, and the ability to recognize where they are and act accordingly. Pass the test and she gives you what you need. Fail it and she reminds you, viscerally, that the forest does not care about you. Neither does she, that's the point. Scholars have spent generations trying to pin down what she is, sometimes labeling her a cloud goddess, death, winter, earth mother, totemic ancestress, female initiator. None of those definitions fully hold. Andreas Johns, who wrote one of the most comprehensive academic studies of the character, concluded that there can be no single correct interpretation or understanding of Baba Yaga. That ambiguity is the point. That is her. Baba Yaga is primordial feminine energy given a name in a chicken-legged house. She is what happens when power exists completely outside the institutions built to contain it. Something ungovernable, something unclassifiable, and ancient in a way that makes the questions of her origin feel almost rude. And that, precisely that, is what made her dangerous, the fact that she could not be owned, explained, or controlled. Here's what D&D kept. the hut in the desolate wilderness, the bone decorations, the skulls, the mortar and pestle, the sense that you are standing at the edge of something old and dangerous. The grandmother figure is still there, along with the tests, the exchanges, the bargains that will cost you more than you expect, and the forest waiting just beyond the edge of civilization. They kept every visual and every structural element, but D&D looked at one of the most complex and morally ungovernable figures in Slavic folklore and decided they want the feeling of her, the weight of something ancient and strange when a player steps into that hut. And then they replaced what she is. They replaced her essence. In folklore, Baba Yaga tests you. In D&D, the hag manipulates you. Baba Yaga's bargain is a matter of consequence. You receive what you ask for, what you earn, what your behavior makes possible. Whereas the D&D hag's bargain is constructed as a trap, something designed to exploit you rather than reveal you. She is not measuring your character, she's trying to break it, not because you failed, not because you transgressed, but because she wants to, because she enjoys it. D&D's hag delights in suffering. She loves corruption. She takes pleasure in making people miserable. And that emphasis matters because it gives her a selfish motivation, defined entirely by malevolence. Baba Yaga does not work like that. She does not care about your suffering one way or the other. She has rules and you either navigate them or you don't. The forest does not enjoy the winter. It simply arrives. The D&D hag, by contrast, is built around motive, and that motive is suffering. Not balance, not consequence, not something ancient or ecological, but the simple desire to harm. And that is the entire logic of the figure rewritten. Give her that kind of motive, and what she is becomes something you can explain by what she wants. She stops being something you have to understand, and becomes something you have to oppose. The ambiguity collapses and the tests disappear. What remains is a creature whose behavior is already explained before the encounter even begins. But while Dungeons & Dragons encoded that version of the hag, it didn't necessarily invent it. It inherited it, at least a form of it, already shaped by centuries of moralization. Already stripped of its original function and reduced to something legible and predictable. And when you keep everything on the surface while replacing the logic underneath, it may not look like anything has been lost. It may look like the original was preserved, but it wasn't. What you're looking at isn't Baba Yaga or a hag anymore. It's the Wicked Witch. Now we step out of the mythical forest for a moment and into a specific moment in history. Because the figure in the stories and the woman in the village were never entirely separate. The stories shaped how she was seen, and the way she was treated shaped the stories in return. Early modern Europe, when the authority of the church was tightening its grip on social life, belief, and behavior, and the transition to capitalism was beginning to enclose land, reorganize labor, and redraw the boundaries of who could survive independently. The hag didn't begin as a monster myth. She was a type of person, a woman who lived in villages, who existed at the edges of the structures that were forming around her, and who did not fit cleanly within them or submit to them. She might be a widow who never remarried, or a woman who held land in her own name, or someone people went to when they needed help that official institutions either couldn't provide or refused to acknowledge. She knew things. How to ease a birth, how to treat an illness, how to navigate a world that was often indifferent to whether you survived it. None of that knowledge came from the church or from a university, and more importantly, it didn't answer to either of them. That independence made her valuable to the people around her, but it also made her increasingly difficult for these institutions to tolerate as the structure of society began to change. As Europe moved out of the feudal systems and toward something even more centralized and controlled, the margins people had relied on for survival began to close. Shared lands were enclosed, local practices were pushed aside, and authority consolidated into institutions that could regulate both labor and knowledge. In that environment, a woman who existed outside those systems became a problem that needed to be resolved. She became a witch. Not all at once, and not always the same way, but over time, women like this were folded into a single category, named, feared, and punished as witches. The witch hunts are often framed as a burst of superstition, but Silvia Federici explains them as part of a broader restructuring of society. When an accusation of witchcraft was leveled at a woman, it changed what could be done to them. It turned economic pressure and social tension into moral justification, making it possible to dispossess, punish, and remove people while insisting that what was happening was necessary. Land could be seized, knowledge could be discredited, and punishment could be carried out, all under the logic that something dangerous was being eliminated rather than something valuable being destroyed. You can see this most clearly in the conflict over healing. For centuries, the people most responsible for everyday medical care were women or cunning people. Midwives, herbalists, and other forms of cunning folk whose knowledge was built through practice and passed through communities rather than institutions. Keith Thomas documented these worlds of popular belief in detail. Women who traveled miles to tend to the sick, whose fees were paid in material like bacon and wool, whose consultations were the first and often only recourse for people the emerging medical establishment had no interest in serving. These were figures embedded in their communities, and they represented a form of knowledge that institutions could not easily control. As the professional, male-dominated medical class began to emerge, supported by both church and state, that older system of community-based care did not simply fade. It had to be displaced. As Barbara Einrich and Deidre English document, the witch trial became part of that displacement. In the witch hunts, the church explicitly legitimized the doctor's professionalism, denouncing non-professional healing as equivalent to heresy. If a woman dared a cure without having studied, she's a witch and must die. The licensing laws that created the medical profession had already barred women from universities that granted those licenses. The path to legitimacy was deliberately closed before the demand to walk it was made. That was the point. Calling these women mistaken would not have been enough to remove them. Calling them dangerous, it did. At the same time, broader economic changes were increasingly pushing women out of visible waged labor and into the domestic sphere, redefining their role in terms of dependence and reproduction. The good woman became one who fit cleanly within that structure. Those who did not could not simply remain exceptions. They had to be explained. And the explanation that emerged did not happen all at once. It accumulated. Independence became deviance, knowledge became suspicion, a life lived outside certain constraints became evidence of something fundamentally wrong. What had been a recognizable kind of person, difficult maybe, perhaps ungovernable, certainly began to be recast as something categorically other. Something that existed outside the rules entirely, and something that threatened the order itself. At that point, the figure stops being descriptive and becomes functional. She is no longer a woman who does not fit into the church and state's designs of society. She is the line that defines what fitting means, a boundary marking the edge of what the system will permit a woman to be. D&D didn't invent the evil hag. It inherited her, fully formed, thoroughly demonized, already stripped of function and reduced to motive. They didn't invent her, but they did codify her. So what did we lose? What might have been if Dungeons & Dragons had kept the hag intact? If it had kept the logic that Baba Yaga operates on, instead of flattening her into a generic evil witch or fairy? Look at what exists when we go looking through the ashes. The Kalak brings winter down from the mountains with a hammer. She shapes the landscape itself. She's a season, the cold that kills so that spring can return. A force of amoral nature, not cruelty. The Morrigan appears on the eve of battle as an old woman washing the blood from the armor of those fated to die. She is not causing the death and reveling in the misery. She is witnessing death, standing at the threshold between what is living and what is about to die. To meet her is to be seen. The Greek Moirai, the Fates, do not judge, they do not punish, they do not reward. The three of them measure, cut, and end without preference or judgment as the structure through which life becomes finite at all. None of these figures are explicitly evil, nor can they be understood through intention. Each exists because something in the world requires them to exist. The Kaluk, because winter must come. The Morrigan, because death must be witnessed. The Moirai, because every life must end. They are ungovernable, dangerous, operating by rules that are not your rules. But they have a logic. They are defined by what they are, not by what they want. They stand as naturalistic forces of transition and of thresholds. Their presence is justified through necessity. This is the kind of structure that disappears when monstrosity is reduced to motive. In systems like D&D, as Stang and Trammell describe in their account of the ludic bestiary, moral identity and statistical identity collapse into one another, so that what a creature is becomes inseparable from what it does. Difference becomes readable and behavior becomes legible. The unknown is translated into a set of values that can be interpreted before any encounter even begins. Once that translation is complete, a figure no longer needs to be understood through interaction. It only needs to be opposed and destroyed. That is what got burned out. In the old mythic register, figures like Baba Yaga do not operate through legibility in that sense. They are not structured around interior motive, and they are not organized by moral alignment. Their meaning is produced through interaction, through what happens when you enter their space, not through what they secretly are. That is why they can help and destroy you through the same logic without contradiction, and why their power feels indifferent rather than personal. And that is also why modern monstrosity so often moves toward interior explanation. As feminist work on monstrosity has shown, particularly in accounts of the monstrous feminine, described by Barbara Creed, what becomes coded as monstrous is often what resists incorporation into a stable moral or social order, especially when it takes form through female bodies that cannot be cleanly contained within those systems. Monstrosity becomes a way of giving narrative shape to what cannot be fully absorbed. Seen in that light, the Hag in Dungeons & Dragons is a figure whose logic has been reorganized so that everything about her can be interpreted through intent. She becomes someone who wants rather than something that operates. And once that happens, the ambiguity that defined older versions of the figure is no longer necessary. It has already been replaced with a simple explanation. Because in the end, these figures were never only about danger, they were about contact with systems that do not care whether you understand them. Systems that operate whether you name them or not. Winter does not explain itself, the Fates do not justify themselves, and Baba Yaga does not need to want anything in order to matter. If you bring a Hag into play, the useful question is what she enacts, what structure she represents, what conditions become visible through her presence, what shifts when someone enters her domain and has to move within her logic. The encounter becomes a way of revealing the rules that already exist in that space and what it costs to navigate them. Give her back that indifferent force of nature logic. Give her back her function. Give her back the thing that was burned out of her, because she is still out there, at the edge of the forest, at the edge of the map, at the edge of what your game is willing to name, and she is waiting to see how you behave.